Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dave Clow. I'm on the Stewardship Committee. It's crunch time on the budget, folks. So what I'm asking this morning is, as we approach this budget season, please look at the budget, see where we are. I think those of you who've been, kind of watching this all along understand that the church we're fully staffed, we're doing a lot, but it costs a lot. Our income has not been keeping up with our needs, so we need a lot of prayer, a lot of consideration. As we move into this, please look at the budget. Talk to us. If you have questions, find somebody on the stewardship question or on the committee and ask questions. We need your involvement. We need your input. It's very important. Like I said, at this point, it is really crunch time for us. A lot of decisions need to be made. We want to do all these things. We pray about these things. We want these things. Now we've got to figure out how to pay for them. So as we move forward, I'm just asking you now to be very prayerful in consideration of our budget needs and the church's needs as we move forward. Thank you.
I think we're on. Last week we went roughly 1800 to 1845. Then there's the period of the Civil War, of course, that takes over the lead up to it. The Civil War itself continued splits between North and South, including in the church, to 1865. Now, from 1865 onward, we see church growth. Baptists become one of the largest denominations in the United States. Missionary outreach is expanded, schools are started, and so, but there are the controversies that preceded the Civil War are there, but there aren't very many new ones. But some things happened from 1865 to 1900 that we want to touch on. But we're going to take them individually because what we're really going to talk about is roughly 1900 to 1976. But the roots of some of these conflicts and issues that take place all the way up through the mid-20th century start in the 19th century. But so far, we're going to take up the rise and growth of the African American church. We're going to take up the idea of fundamentalism, of which we are direct inheritors, and then we're going to take up something called dispensationalism, which is a way of looking at the Bible and a theory about the way things go together. And you may never have heard about it, and frankly, it's disappearing. So you would say, why in the world would we talk about something that is pretty much gone? Well, it illustrates a couple important things, and it has one lasting legacy in terms of Baptist belief we need to talk about. And if we have time, and I don't think we will this morning, we'll talk about the movement beginning in the late 1960s, going through the 70s and early 80s, called the Jesus movement, which actually impacted Baptists a great deal. However, if we don't get to that, some of you are far too young to have gone through the Jesus movement. Many of us are actually old enough to remember quite well what the Jesus movement was. So if we don't get to it, it's not such a big deal. So I want to start this morning with, African American Baptist. And so evangelization of blacks was an ongoing concern in the antebellum period. That's just before the war. Earliest attempts to evangelize African Americans were by the Anglican Church, now the Episcopal Church. But Baptist efforts thrived after the two Great Awakenings. So we mentioned that in the early 19th century, starting in Pennsylvania and then going, there was another Great Awakening. Well, that led to greater evangelization of slaves, African Americans. Okay. By the time of the antebellum period, most Southern blacks who professed Christianity called themselves Baptist. Southern slave leaders deeply distrusted slave evangelization. And as William Klebsch observed, baptism threatened to make the slave so nearly a person that no Christian could hold him in slavery. I'm going to read that again. Baptism threatened to make the slave so nearly a person that no Christian could hold him in slavery. Notice he didn't say baptism would make him a person. Nearly a person, right? And historian Walter Pitts suggested that the Baptist ethos appealed to blacks for several reasons. First, Baptists incorporated magical power into church doctrine, creating a mystical community that enabled a convert to heal and prophesy. Right? Second, baptismal immersion appealed to African Americans because of its similarity to African water rites and rituals. Third, and perhaps most significant, was autonomous native formation of a congregation without permission from anybody else or jurisdiction allowed them to be what? To a certain extent, free. They could form a church, and it could be Baptist without anybody's permission. The single most important outgrowth of the Great Awakening was that blacks who had been converted at the revivals formed their own independent congregations, thereby beginning the political, social, and economic autonomy of black Christian population. Black preachers were careful not to appear to encourage insurrection, but there was an undercurrent of liberation in all of their discussions. Right? As I mentioned last week, I think it was, the outbreak of various slave revolts led to greatly curtailing slave gatherings, including religious worship gatherings. Most African Americans worshiped from then on in white churches. And because they were Baptists, here, this is going to change later on. What that meant was all across the South and the frontier, African Americans and white Christians were what? Worshiping together. Blacks were members of the congregations. They were received as members, formally, lettered out, which, as we do today, you send a letter of transfer if somebody moves to other churches. But things were not equal. Slaves were not allowed to vote on calling a pastor or other church matters, and the seating was usually segregated for both slaves and blacks. So I'm going to, one more statement, then I'll turn it over to Jeff. After emancipation, many blacks found that their second-class status was perpetuated. This led to the withdrawal of blacks from white-dominated churches and establishing black churches all across the North and South. So I'm going to take a break there. Yeah.
To introduce to you this morning our primary missionaries. We have 4 primary missionary families that the church supports, and this is Mark and Diane Shade, and they are here today to share with us their life in the mission field, and they're going to do a little commercial here, and then we'll hear more from them during the service today. But if you just take a moment to share, that would be fabulous.
So we're missionaries in Nicaragua. We've been there a little over 7 years. We haven't been to the U.S. until now for 4 and a little bit, almost not quite 4.5 years. That was not intended. That was the result of COVID and other complications. Our primary work is to come alongside pastors and work shoulder to shoulder, side by side with them. We try very hard never to be a boss. I am not an authority to teach to them. I can't tell them how to be a better pastor or how to preach better, but I can come next to them and encourage them, pick up a shovel and work with them. And that's the way we try to work. It opens a lot of doors. When you're not somebody's boss, they can see you in a completely different light and include you in their life and their work differently than if you're in an authority role over them. So we serve them in many ways. We have our house open to them. They will come, if they have to come to Managua for some medical care or government legal work or something, they'll come and stay at our house. We've had others stay at our house for an extended time. But we try to serve them in every way that we can. And our goal, if you were to ask me, what are we trying to achieve? Our goal is to start a fire in their hearts that would cause them to go out and share Jesus Christ with their neighbor and the next town over and the next town over, until Nicaraguans themselves have carried Jesus Christ to every person in Nicaragua. But the second goal would be that they begin to send their own missionaries into the world. That's what we're trying to achieve. We want to start a fire or a wave that would cause them to rise up, cover their country with Jesus Christ, so that at the end they say, hey, we need to send missionaries out into the world. And that's what we're trying to achieve. In short, that's a bit about our ministry. You have any questions?
Could you tell us a little bit about the social and political circumstance in Nicaragua and how that shapes how you minister?
Well, that's a very good question. Politically, it's a difficult place. They're becoming more and more closed. They've canceled or removed or kicked out about 3,100 nonprofits or NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And there are so few left, and even the ones there are under great and growing pressure. We're blessed that at the moment our mission is in Chicago, but they have no other presence in Nicaragua. So we're off the radar, at least for today. We're not being looked at or monitored as far as we know. But to that end, we don't do a lot of high-profile, public, visible things, and that's another reason it's good to work through the pastors. If I go and drive and visit a pastor or 2 or 3 of them at a house, no one's paying attention because I'm not gathering 100 people together in one place. And it's the public gatherings that will cause the bigger trouble. So we work in a little bit smaller groups to stay less visible. We have to be very careful with things that we say. Somebody told me a story recently from Cuba, but it would apply for Nicaragua. They had a closed Bible study group. Cuba is extremely restrictive, and there are certain principles, biblical principles, you're not allowed to teach by law. Those are laid out, and you're not allowed to teach those. And if you do, you get in trouble. Well, there was a closed Bible study group. Everybody was a Christian. Everybody was a member. And somebody brought that topic up, and they talked about it, and a week later, the government showed up. And you have to ask, how did they know? Well, someone in the group talked. So we're not that bad at the moment, but at the same time, we do have to be very careful of what we say. For example, here I would tell you I'm trying to raise up an army of missionaries to cover Nicaragua. I would never use the word army inside of that country. Coming from the mouth of a foreigner, that is bad. So we try to work in ways that don't draw a lot of political or public attention, but that are profoundly touching and encouraging and motivating to the Nicaraguans themselves. And that is a big part of what we do. We try to keep it quiet, but effective.
So when people started calling Jesus king, you can imagine how that caused a lot of trouble for him and his group. The same kind of political and social and quasi-religious tensions are with us today, no different than they were for Jesus. And I find that very both troubling, but also, we know the gospel can prevail. And so that's what's exciting.
Yes, sir.
Was there a primary religion? Is that Christian?
Historically, they have been primarily Catholic, but the overwhelming majority of people may have never stepped foot in Catholic church in their life. They simply say, I'm Catholic because their family is. The problem is, of course, if you try and teach anything the Catholics don't agree with, you have a hard hill to overcome. Because the common Catholic beliefs are powerful and present, even though they never go to church. Things about Mary, things like that. Those things are strong in the culture, even though no one even studies them. They learn them growing up. So overcoming that is hard. And they have a really strong, odd perspective. If you were to ask me, in a very broad sense, Are Catholics Christians? I would say yes, because they do have Jesus Christ close to the center, not at the center, but close to the center of their religion. So they are following Christ. But in Nicaragua or Central America in general, Catholics will say, I am not a Christian, I am a Catholic. And if you call them a Christian, they are very offended. But they know who Christ is. They know they should follow Christ. They know he died on the cross, but they don't want to be called a Christian. So there's a large barrier there. The way to overcome that is through doing things socially and culturally that attract their attention and time. We run carpentry shops to have local Nicas teach carpentry and use power tools. A man could grow his entire life, live his entire life in Nicaragua and never touch a single power tool. So if you offer a class with power tools, you will get boys from 8 years old all the way to the oldest man in the village, and they will come and stay there and listen. Then you've got their attention, and you can teach the more broad principles about sin and salvation. And you don't have to get mired down in Mary and all of that. But Catholicism is the primary and definitely hard to overcome. Yes, sir.
What about the Bible reading? Is that they allow people to read it?
Yes, that is at this time open with no problems, with one exception. In 2018, they had a political uprising. The Catholic Church had always supported the government until that time. The government did some wrong things, and the Catholics called them out and stood against them. And since then, they have prosecuted or persecuted the Catholic Church to the point that they made nuns leave the country. They made them walk out of the country. They wouldn't let them get on a bus or a taxi or a car. They made them walk out. They have kicked out priests and other people. You are no longer allowed to import a Catholic Bible. If I go through the airport with one, not that I would, but if I did, they would confiscate it. And if you send in a container of Bibles, even though they're not Catholic, they will literally open and look through the pages of every single Bible to see if you have highlighted any scripture that might relate to government that they wouldn't like. So at the moment, reading it is perfectly fine. Having it is perfectly fine. But bringing it in is getting to be much harder. And they're aiming towards communism. So communism in general tries to quash religion.
And if you are trying to distribute Bibles, you have to keep a list, and you have to get the identification number of every person you give that Bible to.
And they will collect that list. So they're beginning to restrict the sharing of the Bible.
So you have to know the language to speak to people, just not like reading the Bible.
Yes. And one thing we have come to learn most powerfully in the last year and a half to 2 years, language really is equally tied to culture. Language is not just vocabulary. Language is not just grammar and order of words. Language is culture. And if you truly want to reach someone in a different culture with a different language, you must not only learn the words and the structure and the grammar, but you need to learn the culture. And the reason is I guess the easiest way I can say it is this. They don't even think in the same patterns or ways that we do. If you ask them to describe a glass that's half empty, they're going to come up with totally different words than you and I would. They think differently. They see it differently. So if you want to reach them effectively, you have to learn how to think the way they think. Because if you just think a regular North American thought and translate the words, they will look at you and not understand at all what you just said. But if you can find the words they prefer because they think they come at it from a completely different perspective. I was talking with somebody recently and they said, what do you mean? I said, well, imagine if you're in a big city and you're giving instructions. You're giving instructions coming from the south up, but you didn't realize the person is coming from the north down. Your instructions make no sense at all. Watch for a McDonald's on the right, turn left at the Baptist church, and they're going, there's no McDonald's, there's no Baptist, they can't understand your instructions. It's that different because culturally, they come from one direction and we come from another. And I'm not criticizing, I'm not saying we're better or smarter. They view things differently, and it causes them to think their thoughts, the patterns of words, the ideas differently. So if you want to reach them, you have to learn their ideas, their values, and use language that relates to their values. And that would be true anywhere you go around the world that has a different culture and language.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Comments?
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Okay, so let's get back to African Americans. The same movements that, and the same problems and issues that impacted white Baptists affected African American Baptists. Many African Americans, remember last week, I don't know if you were listening, we went over landmarkism. We're landmarkers. Most understood their own persecutions to be a direct link to earlier persecuted minorities, Donatus Waldensians and other Europeans who were descendants of the first Christians. Calvinism was prominent, and Black Baptist churches used the same Calvinist-based confessions that white churches did, like the Philadelphia Confession and so on and so forth, New Hampshire Confession. During the latter half of the 19th century, Black Baptists established a number of schools, and this is important, some 28, including Selma University, Spelman Seminary, Georgia, Shaw University, North Carolina, Roger Williams University, Tennessee, Bishop College, Texas, all of these in the, from 1878 roughly through 1881. But here in Virginia, Virginia Union University was established by a Black Baptist in 1865, goes back that far. In Mississippi, Natchez Seminary was founded in 1876, and its president, Charles Ayres, said this: "When will the colored people do these things, build houses and steamboats, make books, gain wealth, instead of being the football of other men?" Ayres answered himself, "When they have education." So education was extremely important in this period, and it's the foundation of many of the historically black colleges and universities in this period. But relations between African American conventions, like Southern Baptist Convention, the Virginia Baptist Associations, et cetera, and institutions were often cordial and often conflicted. Many African American church leaders concluded for the black population to advance, it needed its own institutions and associations. Some whites were hostile to blacks, right? Others sympathetic. But even the sympathetic individuals were paternalistic. It's like, oh yeah, you come and be part of us, and yes, we'll give you money and help oversee your institution, but listen, you poor dumb people, we need to tell you how it works. Well, they got that. And so many conventions and associations developed between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century, and they understood there was a need to consolidate these entities among the blacks, their own missionary societies, their own publishing societies, and so forth. They needed to organize them, but they were no longer willing to cooperate that closely with whites. Relations between whites and blacks continued into the 20th century to be deeply conflicted in the churches as well as the greater society. But these conditions led to a meeting in 1895 of representatives of the Baptist Foreign Mission Convention, which was African American, the American National Baptist Educational Convention, which was African American. The meeting happened in Atlanta, Georgia, and led to the formation of the National Baptist Convention of America, with Elias Morris as its first president. He served in that office until the year he died in 1922, right? He was succeeded by W.B. Johnson, pastor of Second Baptist Church, and he's going to write something I'll read you in a minute. But what's important about the National Baptist Church? It's the second largest Baptist denomination in America and maybe the second largest in the world. A lot of Baptists don't even know it exists. But the National Baptist Church has 8,415,200 members in the United States. That's a lot, right?
Those are individual people or church?
Those are individual people. And I'm going to talk about the breakoff group, which has millions, right? So we tend to look at SBC, we tend to look at the Northern Baptist Churches, which is the Baptist Church USA, et cetera. We look at CBF. We don't realize that all of those together don't equal the numbers of the National Baptist Church, right? So Johnson wrote this, so far as and this is this tough thing to hear, so far as the Anglo-Saxon civilization is concerned, it may be compared to the religion of Buddha, Confucius, or Muhammad, for there is less Christianity in the Anglo-Saxon civilization as practiced, all caps, practiced when he wrote this, than in those religions which are called heathen. Then, brethren, let us preach Christianity and not Anglo-Saxon civilization. What they were experiencing was what? In their daily life. Profound racism from the churches around them. And they were calling out the churches and saying, if you're really Christian, why are you doing this? Right? As segregationist sentiment and legal support for it increased, that's roughly 1890 to 1910, Black Baptist churches greatly expanded as places of sanctuary. But divisions continued and actually got more pronounced in the black church as in the white church. Now, I was able to, I guess it was in 1967, the first church in Virginia to accept a black family as members was Second Baptist Church in Richmond. However, they were provisional members, which meant they couldn't vote. 1967. This is in the period that some of us are old enough, again, to remember was called what? The governor called for massive resistance against integration. So I was actually very pleased to say that I pastored Bellevue Baptist Church on Fort Hunt Road, which is the first church in Virginia to accept an African-American family as full members, unrestricted in voting, 1967. 6 months later, they made him, the man, a deacon, which was just unheard of. You know. But as late as 1967, we're still having to go through this stuff. Now, Norman Yance, the pastor, went through terrible criticism stuff for having done that. And the church did not vote unanimously. Although it was a fairly large church, they only lost 3 families, but they lost 3 families because people did not want to integrate the churches. So in 1952, D.V. Jameson retired as president of the National Baptist Convention. He was succeeded by Joseph H. Jackson at the same time. And at this point, the National Baptist Convention approved a new constitution that ended unlimited terms for the president. That's because Jameson, I think, had served like 5 terms, and they said, we got to put an end to this. So the restriction was 4 terms, they were 1-year terms, plus 1 year in between before you could run again, right? Another 4 years. Jackson and his supporters refused to abide by the new constitution, leading to a split in November 1961 and went to court several times. But the courts, what's the court's attitude to what people do inside a church?
They say they don't have jurisdiction.
No jurisdiction. Hands up. We're not touching this, right? We can't. So this led to a split. In November 1961, in Cincinnati, Ohio, the Progressive National Baptist Convention was formed as a break-off group. It currently has, it has partnered on and off from 1970 with, by the way, the American Baptist Churches USA, which is the old Northern Baptist. Excuse me. It currently has 1.5 million members. It is not a small body. It's very active. If you see some of the largest churches in this area, for example, I think Alfred Street in Alexandria, which had thousands of members, it's Progressive National Baptist. Why is that partly important? Okay, those participating in the split, right, who are behind the split, include such notable Baptists as Gardner Taylor, Martin Luther King Sr., Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, Benjamin Mays, Vinkle Booth, and to some extent, Jesse Jackson. So those of us, again, who are old enough to remember the 1960s know all of these names, because one of the things that actually created the split was a difference in how to approach civil rights. Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, what is that, the Southern...
Baptist Leadership Conference.
but also the Southern Law, what is Center for whatever the legal... Southern Party Law. He was part of that. Thank you. They wanted an aggressive, what they said, enough's enough. It's time for us to march in the street and so forth. Many in the NBC weren't part of it. And so Jackson removed Martin Luther King Jr. from all of the church offices he had in the NBC. And he becomes a mover and shaker in the Progressive National Baptist. So one of the reasons we need to know about this is we often concentrate on the SBC and on the CBF, and sometimes on the Northern Baptist as though we were the only Baptist, right? Well, there is a long history of African American Baptist churches that together equal or more than the white Baptist churches. They're part of our shared religious history. And they played an enormous role in civil rights, urban development, and all of these things, which they continue to do till this day. So the African American church has a long history going back to slavery and all the way to today, and they're still active. And if you want to see what's going on I know City of Alexandria because I live there, what's going in Alexandria in terms of programs and social issues for justice, education, feeding, it's, guess who? Alfred Street. So we need to be aware of that, right? So what else happens? We don't have much time. I want to talk about the fundamentalist controversy. And if you have a handout, I'll get to that in a minute. There's too much stuff there to go over, so I gave it to you. Higher criticism is an approach to biblical study that attempts to understand the text of the Bible, which means underlying Greek and Hebrew, right, by applying modern scientific tools such as archaeology, linguistics, historical critical method, history of religions approaches. And although higher criticism has been around since the 17th century, it came to prominence in the 19th and 20th century. Right? We call it liberalism or liberal Bible interpretation. The source of the controversy in the early 20th century was the modernist attack on Orthodox Christian beliefs. Using the above-mentioned tools, modernists questioned the authorship and the authority of the Bible, the virgin birth, the existence of miracles, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and of course, the 7 days of creation. Because in 1859, anybody know what happened in 1859? Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, right? So, fundamentalist modern controversies were not among Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, etc. They included Baptists. Baptists attempted to adapt religious ideas to modern culture. You know, how do we make our Baptist ideas fit with the new world we live in? God is immanent in human culture, which meant God is in the Bible, but God is also present in what? The culture and society we live in, so we need to look for God in all of these modern developments that are happening. And that society is moving toward the realization of the kingdom of God on earth, which goes back to what? Plymouth Rock. That society itself was going to create utopia. And the areas of controversy abounded with regard to the Bible, society, and evolution. Methodists and conservative Presbyterians were deeply involved, and Presbyterian William Jennings Bryan, a prominent three-time presidential candidate, is today only remembered for one thing. What was that? The Scopes trial, which took place from July 10th to July 21st, 1925. It was emblematic of the struggle between fundamentalist Christians and the rapidly secularizing world. And it has profound impact on Baptists, and it has worked to create what? Between Baptist fundamentalists and the world around us. War. We're still fighting teaching of evolution versus creationism. What Baptists consider God's moral principles in schools, and so it goes back all the way to the early 20th century. This, where Baptists are suddenly confronted, and it literally is suddenly confronted with a modern vision of the world that contradicts theirs. And Baptists have never what? Never come to grips with how we negotiate that intersection. We're still at war. But it was deeply a Baptist movement as well as others. Progressive Baptists in the North included, these are, if you know Baptist history, these are who's who. William Newton Clark, Colgate Theological Seminary. Alva Hovey, Newton Theological Seminary. Augustus Strong, Rochester. William Rainey Hopper, president of the University of Chicago. Fellow faculty members, Ernest DeWitt, Burton and Edgar J. Goodspeed, Shaler Matthews, who's a big name. In the South, it was E.Y. Mullins, William Lewis Poteet, Edwin McNeil Poteet, Baptist pastor and president of Furman University. I mean, these are big names, right? And so this split happened in Baptists as well as others, where the conservative evangelicals said, no, we got to stop this. But others associated with the modernist movement included Walter Rauschenbusch, who was a pastor in Brooklyn, New York. He is an American Baptist, and he pastored this church in Brooklyn, and he wrote a famous book. And do you know what he is famous for in the whole Protestant religious world? He created the social gospel movement that we think come from other traditions. It's Baptist. It started with the social gospel, started with us. He even created the name in a book called A Theology of the Social Gospel in 1970. So this sort of social activism-centered religion comes from Baptist. Shaler Matthews, the University of Chicago, wrote, the use of the methods of modern science to find, state, and use the permanent and central values of inherited orthodoxy in meeting the needs of a modern world was the very definition of modernism itself. That's a complicated way of saying what? There's some really kind of neat principles in the Bible, and we'll pull those out, and the rest of it we can what? Just leave behind, because they're not true anybody, but there's some probably really good moral things in there we can keep, and they'll help us navigate the moral problems of the modern world. These are Baptists. They affirmed evolution, the use of psychology and sociology and biblical studies, philosophical systems, et cetera, et cetera. Now, later on, some became outspoken critics. Now, how did the church respond to this? That's what your handout is. In a set of 90 essays published in 12 volumes between 1910 and 1915, fundamentalists responded to the modernist with a collected essays published as the Fundamentals, a testimony to the truth. They became just known as the Fundamentals, and they are the foundation of modern conservative fundamentalist beliefs. Right? And you can just read the chapters there. The fundamentalists were anonymously published by Lyman Stewart and his brother Milton. They were conservative Presbyterians. These essays were widely distributed to Protestant pastors. They just handed them out in the greater church. Having begun in the North, it had its greatest reception in the South and still enjoys a strong following. These fundamentalist views, particularly with regard to the teaching of evolution, abortion, and public morals, were at the heart of the rise of the Christian right in the 1980s. So one of the reasons for studying this, if you want to know where the evangelical Christian right Republican movement comes from that helped to elect Ronald Reagan in 1980, comes right here. It comes from those fundamentals. It comes from the trajectory of this historic movement. That's why fundamentalism is really important for us to know about. Not just that we might agree with, biblically what they're talking about, but that it had a great impact on politics and the development of politics in the United States. So I'm going to switch subjects now. We'll get to the last one we're going to get to. It's called dispensationalism. And this is still with us today. And it has an important message for us. In 1830, between 1830 and 1840, a former Anglican priest and Irish Brethren pastor formulated a method of interpreting the Bible named dispensationalism. It's John Nelson Darby. The term dispensationalism is attributed to Philip Morrow in his 1928 book, The Gospel Kingdom, which is a diatribe against dispensationalism. He had been a follower of Darby, but he turns against Darby and says this isn't biblical, and he writes this book, and that's where we get the name. Although the multiple ages or dispensations of God's dealings with people has been around since Darby in the mid-19th century, Morrow, a determined critic of Darby, was the first to use the term as a description of theology. What is it? I'm just going to go really quickly. Darby divides the Bible into 7 ages. The age of innocence, which is before the fall, conscience from the fall of the Great Flood, human civil government from the Great Flood to Abraham, the promise of patriarchal rule from Abraham to Moses, law from Moses to crucifixion of Jesus, grace from the rapture, grace from the cross to the rapture of the church, and the millennial kingdom, that's the 7th one, God's rest, a 1,000-year reign of Jesus. We'll get to that in a minute. Although not popular in Great Britain or elsewhere in Europe, Darby's teaching gained a foothold in America, particularly in the Great Lakes region. From there, it would spread throughout America, eventually forming a Christian subculture. New York, Boston, St. Louis, and Chicago would be foci for the distribution of Darby's ideas. In particular, the great evangelist Dwight L. Moody and the faculty of Dallas Theological Seminary would make Darby's ideas household names. So how did that happen, and why is it important? A prominent teacher at Dallas Theological Seminary, which is not Baptist, but was founded as an evangelical fundamentalist seminary, is very important to this day. A man named Cyrus Scofield wrote the Scofield. Have you heard of the Scofield Study Bible? All of the notes in there are dispensationalists. It was published by Oxford University Press, and if you had a study Bible, that was the only one available. It was one of the very first ever written, a real study Bible. And if you had one, King James, you grew up with it. The fundamentals are themselves dispensationalists, all right, the ones I just gave you. And Dallas Theological Seminary had a huge influence on this because of its pastors, Charles Feynman, Dwight Pentecost, Herman Hoyt, Charles Ryrie, and John Woolvard. As the Scofield Bible aged, it was essentially rewritten by Charles Ryrie as the Ryrie Study Bible. So many of you may have seen it because it was, particularly in the 60s and 70s, it was the study Bible almost all Baptists and evangelicals used. It was also dispensational. And throughout this period, the influence of dispensational theology was growing as other schools and seminaries hired what? Dallas Theological Seminary graduates. In 1970, a DTS graduate, Hal Lindsey, published The Late Great Planet Earth, all right? It sold 10 million copies, I think, on first printing about the rapture and the tribulation. So dispensationalism was never accepted or popular among the greater, what? Christian academic world, teachers, and really only accepted in the United States and mostly in the South. So we tend to think, we have dispensationalist ideas in Baptists, we think that the whole world actually believes that, when in fact a tiny subset actually believes in dispensationalism. And Baptists don't either anymore. Beginning at really, I think, in the early 21st century, we began to look at it the way people throughout the world do and go, there's no biblical basis for this stuff, right? But just as I said, when we gave up Calvinism, which of the one Calvinist things did we keep when we chopped the rest of the tree down? Once saved, always saved. The only support for that is Calvinism, not the Bible. But when we chopped the rest of the Calvinist structure out, we kept that limb hanging up there all by itself. People are going to be shocked here, but I'm going to tell you, what's the one thing we kept from dispensationalists after we cut the tree down? The rapture. The rapture does not come from the Bible, and you have to do torturous things to the Greek and text to get it. But it was a huge part of dispensationalism, and so it spread throughout the country. But it spread how? And this is why dispensationalism and the rapture idea is so important. It illustrates something of the modern world that we have to deal with. Who made the rapture a household word? Two people. The Scofield Reference Bible and Hal Lindsey. And since then, there have been thousands of references to it in novels, articles, movies. So this does not have an academic background of any kind or support, even among most Baptists who did before, but it shows how powerful what? Popular culture is in determining what people believe. Not what people are taught in seminary and teach you. Not what you read go to a Baptist bookstore or get a modern commentary or read. Much of what we believe has come down to us through popular culture, or I would say a popular subculture of Christian evangelicalism. So it doesn't matter if you believe in a literal 7-year tribulation and you're going to disappear halfway through. It has absolutely nothing to do with your salvation. Nothing, right? And the fact that it's believed by a subculture has nothing to do with your salvation. But it's an example of how we need to be careful about what we hear on the radio and television and movies and novels, and examine them very carefully, because there could be things that do impact your salvation if you're not careful. This one just illustrates a broad multi-million-dollar industry that makes people feel good, but it has no impact on you. But other things about Jesus, the life of Jesus, how salvation comes to us, the teaching of the apostles, they can have a really big difference. And so we just need to be careful. We need to be careful of where the information comes from and what it means for us in our overall faith. Some comments, we're done now. So, go ahead, Bonnie.
It takes a village.
Mm-hmm.
This explains to me, I've worked with the North Star Association here locally for a long, long time. And a number of years ago, there was a North Star effort to pack 5 million meals for Rise Against Hunger.
I do remember
It was
that.
huge success. I was the person who was responsible for trying to get every Baptist church in this quadrant, which were quite a few, and several of them were African American churches, which I had no connection with. I wish they would have just been kind enough to tell me we don't want to participate, but they didn't.
Right.
And I had to piece it all out myself. That I think quite a few of the African American churches do not participate in North Star.
They do not. Some do.
Right. A few do.
A few do. Some do not.
Right. But you're explaining to me it's because they have other organizations that they more closely align with, which makes more sense for them and their mission.
That's correct. And
Yes.
basically, they have parallel organizations, and they're doing the same thing.
Yes.
And also, this goes back to the period when what? They weren't welcome in our church.
Oh, no.
And so they developed these things on their own because they weren't asked to participate. And so we need to be aware. That's a very important point, Bonnie, about we need to always reach out for greater cooperation. We need to be welcoming. But we also need to be sensitive that they may not want to come here. They might not feel comfortable. And so that's going to take a long time to get over. It's not going to be simply, oh, well, now we're ready. Once y'all get together. It's going to take a long time. And you experience firsthand.
Well, I just experienced last week. Audra and I and others attended the annual banquet of the Lamb Center. And I happened to be seated at the same table with 4 African American folks from the same church, large Baptist church in this area. Conversation, I said, are you all members of North Star? They just sort of glazed over. I mean, their eyes sort of glazed over. But here they are, supporting the Lamb Center, supporting the work in the community, just like Parkwood is.
I was asked to bring greetings from Leland Seminary and North Star to the annual meeting of the northern sort of district of the Progressive National Baptist. It was years ago. And one of the things I noted as you came into the lobby, much like in meetings of the Virginia Baptist or North Star, there were all these tables set up, people behind the tables to give you literature of exactly what you're talking about, all the things they support, missionaries like we just had, feeding programs, all sorts of things. They're parallel with that. So sometimes they're together, but sometimes they're parallel.
The other thing that surprised me about what you said was how early after the Civil War those Baptist seminaries were formed, the list that you gave us, because most blacks couldn't even read and write. So for them to get those seminaries formed as soon as they did, I think is remarkable.
It is remarkable, but they realized they needed what? Education and trained clergy. And they were hugely successful, as you can tell by the numbers. By the way, I think there are like 40 to 44 million Baptists in America right now, by the best estimates. Fully half of them or more are African American. So when we look at the church, what we're doing at North Star or Baptist General Association in Virginia, and there's some large African American churches part of that, we tend to forget that in the Baptist world, guess what? We're not alone here. We're not. And haven't been for 200 years. So that was the reason for going through that, actually.
I want to go back to 1967 when Second Baptist accepted that first for American family. In 67, the Ku Klux Klan was still occasionally marching on Broad Street in downtown Richmond.
That's right. That's right. And
they had done that for a number of years.
And many of our congressmen were members. Yeah. This was not a good time to be African American in Virginia. And it hadn't been a whole lot earlier when I lived here and went to school in Arlington. It was pretty segregated. So anyway, yes, that was massive. The governor, I can't remember his name, called for massive resistance to integration of any kind. And it was rough. So if you want to know why African Americans look at us with, very carefully about what we're going to do next, well, it wasn't that long ago before they really needed to look at us to see what we were going to do next.
In 1998, we went to Slovakia for an English Bible camp, but anyhow, in the town we were in had just had a choir there from Antioch Baptist Church, right south of here.
Yeah.
And they had scheduled like 30 conferences in Slovakia and ended up doing over 100. But it's amazing.
When I was at Bellevue, we regularly had the Alfred Street Bell Choir come. They were a favorite of ours, and we had a couple of joint choir sessions with Emmanuel, which is huge Baptist church, which was down the street, the Black Baptist. And so there are things, have been things that have been going on for years. And we hope things are getting better. But we have to be vigilant about keeping these up and about how we appear. That we're not the paternalistic people that we were, which is, wow, isn't it cute you have a Baptist church? How do we help you? And unfortunately, that's part of our legacy. So if there are no more questions, thank you very much. Next week, Jeff's going to take up, I believe, the events of the 80s and so forth that created the split between strongly conservative Baptists, the creation of the CBF, and that sort of thing. Some of you lived through that too, that period.